Welcome to the Stop Down Photography Podcast, episode 87. I'm Scott Davenport. Today's topic is don't measure your photo success by your keeper rate. Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining. I'm glad to be back with you for another chat about photography, this shared passion of ours. And in today's episode, let's take one more step on our never-ending journey of photography. A trap photographers fall into is how we measure success with our art. We tend to measure success by the number of good photos we make. If a photo outing doesn't produce good work, the shoot is deemed a failure. And the measure of success is equated with our keeper rate. In this episode, I want to challenge that type of thinking and propose a different way about practicing the art of photography and suggest a different way to measure your photo success. If you enjoy the podcast, please share it with a friend, on social media with your camera club, and if you can, please leave a rating for the podcast. Fresh ratings help promote the show, let others find out about it. You can do it directly on Apple devices in the Apple Podcasts app. You can also leave a rating via the web at podchaser.com. Links are in the show notes. When we begin photography, when we're just learning, nearly every photo is good, quote unquote good. In reality, few are good, but in those early days when we're learning by leaps and bounds, the photos we capture this week are markedly better than the photos we captured last week. Now, as time goes on, our eye grows more critical, the photos we consider good are fewer, and maybe the shutter button isn't pressed as often as well. At this point, the measure of success starts to come into play, starts to tug on our brains, sometimes our souls, potentially leaving a level of frustration or discouragement, because after that initial rapid climb in skill, and we've built our foundation in those early stages of our photography, the eye is more critical, the keeper rate goes down. And measuring success by the number of keepers, that becomes a problem. Gauging by the volume of photographs might be a problem too if you're more discerning with your finger on the trigger. You're taking fewer photos because you've got a refined photographic eye. So I don't think either of these, keeper rates or volume of photos, those aren't good indicators of success, of someone who is pursuing the craft of photography, trying to master the art. It's not even really a good measure of improvement. Instead, what about measuring your success by level of effort? Have you picked up your camera this week? How much have you experimented with your work, tried a different subject, practiced a technique you've been working to master? And each time you wrap up a session of work with your camera, sure, of course, you'll review the work, you'll pick out a few photos you like, but also, perhaps more importantly, pay attention to what you learned. Because each time we work with our cameras, we learn something or we reinforce something. We learn what didn't work, which can be equally valuable as learning what did work. Measure your success as a photographic artist with your effort toward improving the craft. I made a passing mention of this a couple of weeks ago in episode 85, focusing on the learning and then the good photos will come. I've also talked about this idea of continued effort, that photography is a long journey. Way back in episode 37, that one was called What Vincent van Gogh Taught Me About Photography. If you haven't listened to either of those, I'll put links in the show notes so you can jump over to them. So as I've talked with other photographers about this idea, measuring success by the amount of effort and not necessarily by the keepers, it takes some warming up to. It doesn't seem to be the natural inclination for the typical photographer. And honestly, it took me a while to get comfortable with the idea, and I still feel that self-imposed pressure to exit a shoot with at least one keeper. I think the challenge with measuring effort and not results is this. It's the polar opposite of the business world. Business measures success by outcome. How little or how much work went into achieving that result is secondary. It's the results that matter. And in the business world, results are usually tied to a deadline, like a quarterly report or the health of the business, the release of a new product. But I think for photographers, for artists, we have to measure success differently. When you are putting in the effort, you are doing the camera work, experimenting, trying new things, exploring new subjects, refining your technique. You are honing your craft. The individual camera sessions themselves, they might not yield immediate keepers, yet you are growing as an artist. Do the work, sustain the effort, and in time, the keepers will come. A bit of studio news that connects with this topic. This past weekend, I concluded my first physical/virtual hybrid workshop, and the final session was the photo share. And this is something I like to do in my workshops because seeing the work of other photographers can inspire us to try something new or just see a little differently, especially when the photos being shared are from places you have been and in the same conditions as your fellow photographers. Without fail, every photo share shows me something I didn't see on location. It's a great way to broaden our eye for photo opportunities. Now, photo shares can feel daunting to some people, and I get that. You're putting yourself out there. You're vulnerable. When I host photo shares, it's not about, here are my killer images. Sure, you got one of those? Well, man, share it. We all love looking at stunning photos. But the emphasis is on learning through the sharing. In these photo shares I do, each photographer shares a set of images, talks about them for a few minutes, and they can share an image that they're proud of, or an image where they tried a new technique, or an image that didn't work, and then share with the group why it didn't work, or how did this technique play out in practice versus theory. The goal is elevating the collective knowledge of the group, and because the spirit of the photo share is so that we can all improve as photographers, it's a very constructive and encouraging environment. Feedback is almost always welcomed, and it's in the spirit of improving as photographers. Now, during this last photo share, there were a few things that jumped out to me. I thought I'd share them with you here, a handful of things. The first is what I'll call the picture in the picture. So sub-compositions within your larger photo that are equally intriguing. Maybe you've captured a wide photo or a broad landscape, or maybe even something more intimate and close up, but getting even closer, taking a photo and making 2 or 3 other sub photos from it. Very easy to do with virtual copies, crops, heck, just even zooming in on your screen. It's a really good creative exercise. And during this past photo share, there were several that we saw pictures within the picture that were equally compelling and told a very different story. Another thing I found interesting was that most of the images were very colorful, very vibrant, and not in an oversaturated, garish way, but just strong color like we see the world. This was largely a sunset type shoot, so there was a lot of nice oranges and the blues of the ocean, all that sort of stuff. But there were no black and white images, none at all. And I found that to be interesting. And there were some that had more muted tones, like a blue-gray palette, or just, kind of just soft, not quite pastel, but just downplayed a little. But everything was color. There wasn't a pure black and white take on anything. And nothing wrong with that at all. But I found that to be interesting, that on this particular group, everything was color. But the big takeaway, the big one, was that everybody sees the same scene differently. We had a group, including myself, 10 photographers. Same set of rocks, same surf, same time of day. Sure, there's variation with each set of waves, but the compositions were very different. Shutter speed choice was different. Whether or not other beachgoers, humans, were incorporated into the photos or not, all those artistic choices made for a vast set of photos, all taken in the same hour at the same beach. Each one told a very different story of the same location. And these are just some of the examples of why I love the photo share, because we learn something and it connects with this idea that the photos themselves, maybe there's a keeper here and there, but just practicing the craft. That is the way I like to approach measuring success. It's the effort. It's trying, learning, and iterating. And as frustrating as it can be sometimes, keep at it. And that next outing with the camera, you're just that much better of a photographer. Before I sign off for the week, thanks very much to everyone that supported the show through comments, reviews, shares on social media, likes on social media. All of that is very appreciated. Super special thanks to the group on Patreon, the members of the Patreon community. It's your financial support that makes this podcast possible. Yes, it does cost money to make the podcast, and it's the Patreon members that keep the engine running on this podcast. So thank you very, very much. I did post that presentation I talked about last week, going through different ways of using masking to emphasize our subjects and process our images with more intent and expression. So Patreon members, if you haven't checked that out, it is in the Patreon feed waiting there for you. It's about 50 minutes or so maybe you want to take it in a couple of chunks. And I always like when I'm able to share one of these things with the Patreon group, a tangible thank you for the support you give the podcast and to my work. And that's going to do it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. And once again, if you did, please leave a rating. That is a zero-cost way you can support this podcast. And until next time, my name is Scott Davenport. Have fun.